Good morning and welcome to the weekly review here live on Teachers Talk Radio. Here to review the week in education with me. We have our usual panelists, Lucy Newberger and Nathan Ginn, who this morning take on the mantle as co-hosts. And we've got a real bumper extended weekly review for you today. Joining us first, we have Neve Sweeney, who is Deputy General Secretary of the NEU. And we have Paul Gosling, who is President of NAHT. And we're going to be, for the first 20 minutes of today's show, we are going to be talking about union responses to OFSTED. We're going to be talking about what the NEU and NAHT have done in the last week, but also what they're going to do in the future about the huge pressures that Ofsted is putting on school leaders and school teachers. Now, the weekly review is all about reviewing education news, and there's only really been one thing in the news, one big thing in the news this week. And I want to take your minds back to Monday morning. It's about 10:30. And somewhere in a primary school, John Rankin schools, Flora Cooper got a phone call saying, "This is Ofsted. We'd like to have our phone call with you in preparation for our inspection on Tuesday and Wednesday." And Flora, well, we don't know what she said, but we know what she wanted to say and what the impression she gave, which was, "You're not coming in." And if I can start with Paul on that one, what did you think when you heard that Flora Cooper was not going to let Ofsted in on that Monday?
Well, I knew Flora was a member of ours, so we immediately made sure she was in contact with NAHT, as we do for any school leader. If they've got any concerns about Ofsted, then contact a union. We reached out. We had our specialist advice and support in place for her. It's a really risky thing. You can't, unfortunately, the law doesn't prevent you or prevents you from saying no to Ofsted. You can't bar the doors to them. You can't stop them. You risk personal fines of about £2,500. They can come in. They can find legal entry. So it is really risky. It's a brave thing to do, and we absolutely get the sentiment behind it. The emotions were very raw that weekend. That's why NHT called for Ofsted to pause for that week, so that because we knew that a lot of people, members in schools, head teachers, their senior staff and teachers would be very upset, worried, concerned about any inspections taking place last week. So we were absolutely with her in terms of the moral idea that Ofsted shouldn't be visiting schools, but unfortunately for an individual to take action, it was very difficult. So we supported Flora through that process, and hopefully that will be fine. So.
Is there no legislation at all under, say, health and safety law on things like that in terms of protecting, the health and safety of students and, of course, of staff in schools that would prevent sort of delaying an Ofsted inspection? We know in one case where I think, was it a childcare provider, where actually it shut down rather than allowing Ofsted to come in. Is this not an option available to school leaders to actually shut the school down because they're concerned about the health and safety of their of the staff who they're ultimately responsible for?
Not at the moment, but we are. NHT are looking. I've got a meeting on Tuesday morning with our legal team, and there are some things we are looking at there. But I'll say no more at the moment because these things can be just nebulous ideas that never come anywhere. But I think there are other responses perhaps we need from Ofsted, but no. I think there is a deferral process you could explain, but the deferral criteria are quite fixed. I do know people have been successful with deferral, particularly when the reasons to defer were liberalised a little bit during COVID, and schools did get Ofsted deferred. Ofsted are under pressure, of course, to inspect, and they have a timetable to get all schools done by 2025. So they're under a lot of pressure, and deferrals on that would really slow down and investigating deferrals, their processes, which is not great. So not at the moment, but let's wait and see.
Yeah, let's wait and see. Now, Neve, from the NEU's perspective, on Thursday you presented a petition, and you were the person who actually physically presented a petition. Could you tell us what that was all about?
So we've had an ongoing campaign to replace Ofsted, and we had always planned to hand in that petition on Thursday. But overnight, between Wednesday and Thursday, they hand in an additional 15,500 people signed that petition. So we went in to hand that over. That's a petition based from our members, school leaders and teachers, of saying that Ofsted isn't fit for purpose. You know, most importantly, it doesn't do what it says on the tin. It doesn't improve lives and it doesn't raise standards. There is no study out there that could help support a head teacher preparing for Ofsted that says if you get 2 inspection teams going in on the same day, looking at the same evidence in the same school, that they will get come to the same conclusion. And the single word judgment is absolutely damaging. It's damaging for school communities. It's damaging for teachers and leaders' careers. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you are outstanding or if you requires improvement. Head teachers and leaders and school teachers report that the process is brutal. And the final defence of the DfE and of Ofsted to say that this is what parents want. Well, I think after the last week of head teachers being really brave to stand up and talk about what it really means to them, their own mental health and their well-being, I think parents now absolutely recognise that this isn't what they need to help ensure that their child goes to a good school.
So the accountability pressures are so high, they're completely draining on school leaders and on school staff because it trickles down. So what do we replace Ofsted with?
Well, we think we have to replace it with an accountability system. And we have to be really clear. We're not saying no to accountability. But also we have to remember that schools aren't closed communities. They are open. They have most of them have parents on the governing body. It's important that local members of the community are on the governing body and see what's happening in their school communities. You can always go and visit a school to find out what's happening. Head teachers are most welcoming and want to show what is going on in their school. But we have to make sure that our accountability system supports our leaders, particularly after the pandemic, particularly after the funding issues that we are going through, that we have an inspection system that is supportive, effective and fair and helps show what schools are really dealing with and how they are performing. And you can't do that on a 2-day visit looking at data without having spoken to a child, a parent or a teacher.
Thank you for that, Neve. I'm going to hand over to Lucy or Nathan now for any further questions. Nathan, you are on mute, I think.
I wanted to ask Paul this because, you know, there are people who are possibly members or, you know, of your union who are working as Ofsted inspectors. And that to me must put us in an incredibly difficult situation then when we are arguing. It is not simply us and them for you or your members then when we are fighting against this. It is current school leaders and, you know, current teachers who are part of this process. How do we go about justifying that circle or completing that circle with ourselves?
Well, I have spoken to a range of members who are Ofsted inspectors as well, and most of those people go in because they've got that idea of reforming Ofsted from the inside, that they can get in there, can be an agent for change. My opinion is that it's really difficult with this current leadership and the way that the framework's written. And I think the problem actually is with the framework at the moment. NHT's position at the moment is not to replace Ofsted. We think reform, because quite rightly, we need something in place to look at safeguarding in schools, whether that is Ofsted or part of Ofsted or whatever. Safeguarding needs to be looked at to make sure that situations are safe for children. Reform, replace, you know, there might be two sides of the same coin, because you, as Neve said, you need to replace it with something. And the danger would be that a replacement would mean that you'd have nothing, just checking, for example, safeguarding for a period of time while you replace something else. So that's a bit semantics. But back to the people in there. The people in there say to me the framework is the real issue. And for me, that's where I've seen a lot of workload and stress come onto schools. Particularly, I'm a head teacher in Devon, where a lot of small schools, and the pressure that gets onto staff, because this current framework isn't so much about the data, it is about the curriculum, and that is often coordinated in small schools by you know, a person who's coordinating 3 or 4 other subjects, that puts a lot of workload and stress onto that person during the inspection. The framework was written back in 2018. I had a stand-up row with Sean Harford at the time about the fact that this framework wouldn't, well, it had political fingerprints all over it, with the phonics stuff in there, with the focus on that, with the cultural capital, which we can have some issues over. We can have some conversations about what cultural capital or cultural literacy and all that sort of stuff. It was a very political framework. It hasn't fully been tested because of the pandemic and the caveats that were put in place. Actually, it's only since September that the full weight of this framework has been on schools, and head teachers and school leaders or school inspectors are telling me it's not right. There's a disproportionate effect for schools with high SEN, for high free school meals in disadvantaged communities, for small schools, for infant schools. The framework doesn't work. The framework needs totally revising. It needs the profession to be far more involved in that, teachers and school leaders. And we need to make sure there's a consistency of the problem I have is you never know, you can never control people, the people that come in and inspect schools. You never know what other agendas they may bring, and how they interpret a framework which has its problems anyway. So you get problems on top of problems. And we're at a point, aren't we? We've had the pandemic, which has caused all sorts of changes to people's working lives and stresses and strains. We've got atrocious funding of schools at the moment, really atrocious. Education isn't as good as it was 10 years ago. Why? Because funding. Simple as that. So inspecting, trying to achieve the same sort of level and bar as we had 10 years ago. And Ofsted reports don't talk about funding. Find an Ofsted report that says the reason this school has been downgraded is because they've lost significant numbers of specialist staff or teaching assistants, or the support services around schools that schools in disadvantaged communities relied on have disappeared, putting this school in a very difficult position, that people are overworked. It's part of a whole system that the whole thing needs to be looked at, the whole system of education, the funding, the support, and this government aren't tackling it. So Ofsted is the tip of an iceberg. It's made the news this week, and it is something that does worry school leaders day in and day out, because it is career ending for some people, both in terms of their health, their mental health, their physical health, and just because judgments go against them and things happen to schools in those circumstances. So there's a lot of stress around it. It doesn't need to be like that. People do not give their best in climates of stress and fear. People need support, and they need to be shown and helped to achieve things that their school might not be doing as well as other schools. So there's a whole cultural reform around this. So yes, reforming Ofsted is part of it. Replacing Ofsted could be part of it. But if you replace Ofsted and don't change everything else, you still might end up with some of the problems. So the whole system needs looking at, the whole purpose. We've never had a discussion in this country about what education is for. So how can you inspect if you haven't actually got a what is education actually for? Is it just about getting jobs? Is it about the whole person? Is it about arts? There's all sorts of conversations that we need in this country at the early part of the 21st century to really get engaged with. At the moment, I wish Ofsted would pause, because it is doing damage to people on a daily basis. And we do need something radical to happen in the next few months to change what's going on there. Whether our position changes after, as I explained to you before this started, NHT have got a policy conference coming up at the end of April. There's lots of motions about Ofsted and probably some emergency motions, and NHT's policy position may shift because of what's been happening and what we've been hearing. So crammed a lot in there.
But... Yeah, no, thank you. and kind of on some of those points, I wanted to switch to Niamh quickly. There was talk there, and certainly in my career, in my time moving through education, when I was in England, there is a position between school improvement, and particularly lower levels of that, and an actual, whether it be safeguarding or an actual measured judgment thing. And certainly Ofsted seem to be shifting themselves into a space where they are involved more in talking about being a supportive, improvement-focused thing that helps the profession in some way. Is that what you hear from people, or is it still just a judgment measure, a grading system?
No, that's not what we hear at all. It's an absolutely blunt instrument, and I think the reason why we have moved away from just reform to replace is because it's a toxic culture, and that culture drives the inspection framework. Now, head teachers have this week talked about this, but we've been hearing this for a long time before about the response that they get when they're asked certain questions, that it appears to be aggressive and probing. It's not supportive. And I've also spoken to our members who have previously worked as inspectors with Ofsted, who have said that they also feel that they are being mistreated, and that the culture and environment with which they are being driven is being led by the top, from the top. And that phrase of culture eats strategy for breakfast is true, that the toxic culture of Ofsted is just beyond repair. And I don't trust them. I don't trust them, and the profession doesn't trust them. And I don't trust them to inspect on safeguarding when they have missed safeguarding concerns and looked at themselves and recognised that they needed to give their inspectors more training recently about safeguarding concerns. So I think we have to seriously look at this. And yes, Ofsted wasn't the only news story this week, but they're all connected. The other story this week is that school vacancies are up 93% on pre-pandemic figures, and that is driven by wider things in the economy and graduate recruitment market, but driven by excessive workload, poor pay, and excessive workload driven by Ofsted. And we have to stand together as a profession and think about what we demand to ensure that our schools and children are getting the best from this system. Because Paul is absolutely right. If you work in a school that has a higher proportion of SEND or pupil premium, you're less likely to be graded good. We know that. You're less likely to get the good. So it isn't a fair system. And if you're graded requires improvement, or the complaints procedure is not transparent, and it is so hard for school leaders and governors to say, actually, you've got this wrong. And my advice to parents and everybody listening is go back and read a recent Ofsted report. It says nothing. It says nothing about the experience that those children are getting in that school over those 2 days. It's a generic copy and paste tick box exercise that does nothing for anybody.
I think it was Alex Ford at Leeds Trinity University who played a little game on Twitter a few months ago where he put an Ofsted report on Twitter and asked people what the grade was. And very few people got, I think it requires improvement overall, but it sounded like a report that was good with outstanding features. And we know ultimately, because under the current framework, quality of education is what drives everything, and that you can be outstanding in everything, but you can only be good for quality of education, and that brings you down. And schools get knocked down on technicalities. I've heard anecdotally of schools which are not part of academy trusts who have been knocked down to sort of accelerate the process of them joining academy trusts. So yeah, but I think there are huge questions, Paul.
Yeah, I do agree with a lot of Neve says, and I have a lot of sympathy for any position, and I guess it's just the subtleties in how much revolution there is, reform and replace is the question. We all think that there's a serious amount. I mean, we're talking root and branch needs looking at. But the first thing they could do literally is remove the cliff edge judgments, because they're not in law. They're actually the way that Ofsted works. They could remove that. We could move to a system, Nathan, like Estin have, of the, what a school does well and what it might need to improve on. And that would be a much more honest approach. All school leaders and all teachers will know the things that in their school need to improve, but they'd also like the things that they're doing well to be celebrated, which actually might be outside the current Ofsted framework as well. Schools do an awful lot of work, particularly those in disadvantaged communities. Before they even get to the curriculum and education, there's an awful lot that goes on that the current Ofsted framework doesn't look at. Schools in middle class communities, let's be honest, they do tend to have higher Ofsted grades, because when Ofsted goes around and talk to the children, when my daughter was in year 4 and doing the Romans, we went to Rome, because that's what you do. Disadvantaged communities don't necessarily have access to that cultural capital that Ofsted are so keen on looking at, because capital actually means money. And that's a big issue if you read Bourdieu. But anyway, we won't go down that route. So Ofsted could actually remove the cliff edge grade in the next 6 weeks, or pause Ofsted, remove the grades, go back and see what that does. Look at the ESTIN, although Amanda Spillman will not look at ESTIN. She's very disparaging about the Welsh system, unfortunately. So there's lots of the complaints procedure as well. Could be that needs to be taken out of Ofsted. Complaints need to be handled by somebody else completely. If you do have a problem, if anyone's listening, get in touch with the union during an Ofsted inspection. Things can be changed actually if you do it while the inspection is taking place. And we need inspectors inspecting for their phase that they're experienced in. It's not right that two secondary school inspectors should go and inspect a nursery. It's not right. It just isn't. It doesn't make any professional sense. It shouldn't be like that in a way, but that's where we are. So there's lots that could be done immediately, within days and weeks, because they require no legislation change. And then we need to get onto the task of replacing or reforming, depending on which side of that particular coin you want to get on with.
I would say as well, on reflection of the Welsh system, I'm sat here in Swansea, under ESTIN. We have no judgments at an overall level, but culturally, and maybe picking up on something that Niamh said about that, is when I was in England, I heard Ofsted mentioned a lot.
Yeah,
I honestly couldn't tell you, and we are in a similar space away from an ESTIN inspection window here, where I am at my school here. I can't remember the last time someone mentioned it. Really, they were talking about things the school needed to do for the school, never in the same way that I found in England, that we were doing it for the Ofsted, if that made sense. And certainly, as I say, there is another possibility in the system, but everyone will be the same people in the system. So will that actually change the culture at all? Would be my question on that. I don't know.
Possible culture comes from the top, though, as Niamh said. We are going to get a change in inspector by December, chief inspector. Whether that changes the culture or makes it worse depends who they choose. And then if we get a new government, we could have an election in October. The government are talking about reforming. I know Niamh would want them to just come in and replace Ofsted, but reforming that. Things are going to be changing. We do need to influence that. There are things that can be done in short term, but there are things that need to be done when we get the opportunities to have an influence. I'll leave you.
I mean, I think it's really interesting that they've put the advert out for the new chief inspector, and this time it says that they must have experience of the education system, which I suppose we should look at and think, oh, well, great, because when Amanda Spillman was appointed nearly 5 years ago, the Education Committee, all of the unions, Ofqual, every educational organisation said this person does not have experience of nursery education, of primary education, of secondary education, or of FE or HE, or the care system, which they also oversee. And yet they still appointed her and extended her tenure. I think it's a real concern. We talk about Ofsted being independent of the Secretary of State. However, they are supposed to be implementing the will of the Secretary of State to improve education. And yet what we've got is an accountability system that is so independent. It appears that the DFE are scared of saying to them, this isn't working. And I don't think the profession and children can just wait for a new chief inspector or wait to see whether culture will change. And I don't think the proposals from the Labour Party go far enough yet. The reason I always talk about replacement of Ofsted, now I absolutely admit that there are people who are employed by that organisation, there are civil servants, but when we say replace Ofsted, they think that their jobs are at stake. There are some very good people working in a very toxic organisation there, and of course their jobs must be supported and protected. But Ofsted is a toxic brand. It creates a physical and emotional response from teachers, support staff and leaders. They feel physically sick when they talk about it. They are exhausted before and after it. And if you speak to children, they also know that Ofsted is coming or due to come. So I think regime change and cultural change are really important. And I think it needs to be changed completely. It's no good just changing what's happening and tinkering inside if the Ofsted brand still exists. And that might just appear to be a name change to some people, but to me it's very important. And it's very important because, and I've been talking about this as a trade unionist and as a teacher since 2014.
I just want to pick up very quickly.
Just say one final thing, Tom, because the reason is the recent tragedy, and it is an absolute tragedy, is not an isolated incident. And we have taken too long as a profession to stand up and speak up to protect the mental health and well-being of our colleagues and our friends.
Thank you, Neve. Just very quickly, I want to pick up on something that Paul said about Ofsted being able to drop the summary judgments. Sam Friedman disagrees. Sam Friedman says that the 2005 Education Act requires Ofsted to identify schools causing concern and gives them the duty to use categories or judge categories in order to categorize schools in terms of those which require concern or need intervention. According to Sam Friedman, the only way to change this is through primary legislation.
I stand corrected. No, Sam is an expert on this stuff, but I was under the impression Neve's shaking her head, but I've been advised that it is relatively simple. They have to identify schools that are failing. I understand the legalities on that, but I'm not sure about the grading system, which has been tweaked anyway. But Neve may know more. She works more in the policy sphere than certainly I do. But Sam knows his stuff on this. But if it needs primary legislation, let's get primary legislation in place. Then, you know, the groundswell needs to be there. We need a real political will to hear the voice of the profession to say this current system is not working for a number of reasons, and that it needs to change. So we need pressure that way. Whether that happens before or after an election, we'll have to see.
Yeah, Neve, did you want to comment on that one briefly?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to contradict Sam because he really does know his stuff, but I didn't think that was the case. I think we are looking into it, but I do think the Secretary of State does have the power to tell Ofsted to pause and for a temporary period whilst that is investigated. And I think that it shows a real lack of understanding and empathy of what is going on in our school communities right now for the Inspectorate not to comment on the issues for 4 days and for the Secretary of State to say nothing.
Well, they certainly paused during COVID, didn't they? So I think we certainly
eventually.
Okay, yeah. I suppose they were monitoring visits. Paul and Neve, you've been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for giving up half an hour on your Sunday morning to come and speak to us. It's been really, really useful to have your perspectives as trade union leaders. So thank you very much. Now, before we move on to our next segment, we need to talk about our sponsors, John Catt Educational. This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Lucy, before we move on, Lucy, what were your thoughts on what Paul and Neve had to say? Was there anything that stood out to you?
I just think it's very interesting, and I was just what I was thinking about is the idea that the whole fear factor of kind of you get the call, the fact that we refer to it as kind of you get the call, and then it's almost a kind of, right, we've got to paint the roses red as best we can for the next kind of couple of days. And I was thinking as they were both speaking about the idea of research and the idea of the fact that, you know, and collecting data and things like that. And the way, you know, when we're talking about research and we're talking about, you know, and we talk about becoming more kind of research-led profession and you look at different studies and all the rest of it. And it's, you know, when you look at an Ofsted report, the kind of the conclusions they draw from sort of very kind of arbitrary data is ridiculous. And I mean, I'm more of a kind of qualitative data person than a quantitative, but the fact that it can come down to the sort of 2-day kind of what is meant to be really kind of a research into, you know, how you're doing and all the rest of it can come down to a word is just ridiculous to me. So I'm sort of sitting here kind of processing the idea of kind of what does a more sort of research-led approach look like, where you're looking into things in a slightly different way? I mean, I'm kind of formulating it in my mind, and I don't know what that would look like. But in thinking about Ofsted reform as a whole, it's the whole way the research is carried out, to me, is what needs a cold, hard look.
Now, in order to continue the discussion about Ofsted and what a future system may look like, or whether we retain Ofsted, reform Ofsted, or replace Ofsted, we're delighted to be joined by Callum Robertson, who's a head of department from Tower Hamlets and also policy officer for Lib Dem Education Association, and Tracy O'Brien, who is a head teacher and the author of the John Catt book, School Self-Review, A Sensible Approach, How to Know and Tell the Story of Your School. Good morning and thank you for joining us. So if we start with Tracy, please. What should we do with Ofsted? Should we retain it? Should we reform it? Or should we replace it?
I'm definitely in the reform camp. I know that there are issues around the name change. So whether we change the name, it's still going to be the inspectorate of some description. So I agree with lots of the things that the speakers have said. I think removing the grades instantly is going to be popular. It's going to be a win, and it's the right thing to do. But I think fundamentally there is a whole raft of things that are wrong with the inspection team. And Lucy, picking up on your point about research, I don't see Ofsted as a research body. I know that there's lots of talk around them being research informed, research engaged. But I think they're too small an organisation to be that sort of busy with research. And there's so many other fantastic players out there. I won't go through them all, but we've got some fantastic groups and individuals doing some really good research about what quality of education looks like, what good looks like, whatever sort of effective language we like. I don't think it's up to Ofsted to tell us what good is in terms of, teaching and learning and how children learn and all those things. So I think in terms of the framework, whatever we call the group of people, I'm definitely on a reform / replace camp. But I don't think, sorry.
No, I'll let you finish.
Well, no, I could go on for ages, but I don't think the grades is the only thing. The grades is what makes it so high stakes, as people said. I mean, I had an inspection myself in January. Somebody in the office passed me the phone. There is no feeling like that when somebody puts the phone in and they whisper, Tracy, it's Ofsted. You go blank. You don't know what to do. And you kind of, do the deep breaths. And most of us know our stuff. We know all about our school, but it's an exam. It's an interrogation, and there's no way around that. But I think some of the other things about the reform agenda are, and it's come up, who the inspection team are, what sector they know. Do they know anything about the context of a school? Because context is everything. The location, the challenges that school faces. And if inspectors don't pay any regard to that, there is absolutely no point of that inspection coming in. I think we remove all the research out of Ofsted. I'm a really massive fan of peer review. So you have your regular annual peer review, which is high quality, whether it's a Challenge Partners model, whether it's a school partnership program model, but it's rigorous. It's brokered not by, let's say Matt to Matt, that there is sort of regional advisors that really broker that on a serious level. I think that forms part of your school self-review. The inspection team come in predetermined, so people know when they're coming. You don't get this ridiculous, it's them on the phone, because that adds to the pressure in the system. And I think the safeguarding is taken out of Ofsted. And I think whether it goes to local authority, but it comes an annual significant event that keeps our children, young people and staff safe, not if a school has an inspection every 10 years, but every single year. So that's a few of my thoughts on that, but I'm in the reform camp.
Thank you, Tracy. And to Callum then, so do we retain, reform, replace? Anything with which Tracy said which you take issue with?
I don't take issue with anything Tracy said. I think it's a very sensible set of views. And as a head of department, I don't get a call. I get an email to say, right, we've got an inspection coming, which is a different feeling. And I have sort of more experienced staff to help guide me through that process. Still a daunting process, nonetheless. When it comes to retain, reform, or replace, I think I'm firmly in the reform camp because we look at it from the teacher's perspective, and we all come in with that particular bias. Now, if I was a parent, and I was speaking to some parents about this actually, and some of my students, one of the things that I think we don't necessarily appreciate is the fact that parents want, parents aren't too bothered about actually teachers' feelings on the matter. What they actually really care about, sadly, they care about school accountability. And actually, we shouldn't be scared of school accountability in the way that you wouldn't abolish the Care Quality Commission, you wouldn't abolish the General Medical Council, any of these bodies. I don't think we should be sort of really leaning into the abolish Ofsted line. I think what we should be doing is actually going, well, what works with Ofsted, what doesn't work, and how can we reform that to make it work? So, for example, safeguarding, I think, would be something that has to be a national and a local focus. So I wouldn't necessarily take it from Ofsted. I would make it a joint responsibility with the local authority. So the local authority may be carrying out those annual inspections, but reporting back to a central inspectorate. Because safeguarding is one thing that, leave everything else aside in the school, we can't afford to get wrong. Because the consequence of getting safeguarding wrong is children's lives are at risk. And that's not something any of us would want to countenance. When it comes to aspects such as quality of education or personal development, this cultural capital aspect, I think, is slightly misleading. If you work in a London school, it's a lot easier to access cultural capital because the funding exists for it with the Mayor of London's travel fund and free museums. It's very, very cheap to take a kid on a school trip in London, if your school's in London. Now, if you go to anywhere on the outskirts of London, so the London Fringe or beyond, you then get hit with astronomical costs. It's not a level playing field. So Ofsted, like Tracy says, actually really need to take into account that school context. And it's those micro policy things that actually a lot of people don't understand, really lean into the fact that actually when we have this debate around Ofsted, I think a lot of the time we're debating rather on emotion rather than actual policy that Ofsted needs to have or doesn't have currently. So I think that's where we need to sort of begin our conversation from, is actually what are the facts on the table? Where's it working? Where's it not working?
Mm-hmm. Tracy?
I'm coincidentally writing another book now about inspection, and I interviewed somebody from Northern Ireland who represents all of the unions, and they've paused Ofsted. They have refused to have Ofsted or their equivalent, the NTI, and they're doing, Callum, just that. They're having a proper sit down talk about what is working and what doesn't work, and until they feel that they have actually come to an agreement on that with a whole range of stakeholders, that they're just not accepting that they should have inspections anymore. And I'm not saying that we should pause inspections per se. I think obviously we have to reform the entirety, which I've kind of come across, talked about a bit. But I think that idea that you sit down with this massive range of experts over a long period of time, yes, we need reform urgently in some ways, but actually we need to get it right. And that goes back to what Paul was saying about what's education for, what's the quality of education, what is education preparing our young people for, which is a much, much bigger discussion, which we're not having. And the idea that the framework is so aligned to current political thinking, I think, is another massive flaw that does need to change.
I totally agree. I think when it looks at sort of like actually putting together a body of people, we also have sort of perceived wisdom. Scotland was trying something quite similar very recently, and Tom Bennett sort of quite intelligently worked out they only had 3 teachers out of something like 59 people on this entire review body. When we make sure we're doing it, yes, we need people from the Education Policy Institute, the Education Endowment Foundation. We also need senior leaders. We also need middle leaders. We also need classroom teachers. There is a space for people from industry. I'm particularly not as critical as Amanda Spielman as most, because actually she did have educational sector experience. It just wasn't in a teaching role. There is a place for people with that experience within our inspection framework. You don't have to be a qualified teacher to know if someone's done a background check on a member of staff or not. There is a place for these people. I think it's how they're deployed. As chief inspector, I don't think that's appropriate, but in some sort of role within Ofsted, advisory or otherwise, actually, there's a perfect place for people who bring those experiences to schools. Just in the same way, I'm going to go out on a limb, assume none of us are chartered accountants on the call. Actually, when it comes to auditing school finance, public sector qualified chartered accountants are pretty important to that process. We need to have experts looking at every aspect of it. I think that's a really important starting point when it comes to a reform panel.
Can I ask then, Callum, you talked there a little bit about the sort of expertise of people looking at different parts. Should we then be thinking about deconstructing an inspection system, and rather than, you know, currently in England, in Wales we get 10 days notice. It was longer. In England it's half a day, and that for me is a deliberate choice at mistrust of the profession. It is done deliberately so that you do not get notice. What is the fear of giving people notice? But also on some of those points you said was, I could have, outstanding finance. I could have an outstanding arts department. I could not get an inspector who knows anything about those things. If we were going to deconstruct it, and I know people have talked about safeguarding being a once a year thing, could we then look at, okay, your finance is an April thing. Your geography comes, and deconstruct the whole element to reduce that pressure then, but have actual experts who can advise making those judgments. Because currently the current system, as much as we can have that within Ofsted, within the body, within the people making the frameworks, it doesn't happen in the school, does it? You get what you get who walks through the door.
I think that's actually a fair set of points. When we look at sort of the half a day notice, I mean, I take pride in sort of, as every teacher or most teachers do, in turning up and actually delivering good lessons every day. Now, we all have our bad days, but actually, I don't have a particular issue with half a day's notice. I think the school shouldn't, if you give a school too much notice, then you can paint an artificial picture. And actually, that's not what we want to be doing with inspections. That's not what we want to be doing with sort of school accountability, is allowing a large multi-academy trust to flood a school with SLT from other schools and say behaviour is incredible. Well, of course, behaviour is incredible if you've got 30 people with walkie-talkies wandering around. Actually, we need to make sure there's a realistic picture. So I've got no issue with half a day or actually on-the-spot inspections. I've got no particular personal issue with that. However, I think if we want to look at genuinely getting the best information out of schools, there is a debate to be had about actually whether schools are submitted, sort of given to annual audits in terms of their finances, their safeguarding, etc. One of the key problems with Ofsted that teachers raise, according to Teacher Tab, is workload. If we switch it to 2 or 3 different things getting done every year, does that increase or decrease workload for teachers? When we've got a profession that, as the previous speaker said, are burning out at a record rate, then actually is increasing workload in that regard necessarily the smartest thing to do? So I think that's something to consider. I've got no particularly fixed opinion on it, to be honest, but we need to actually think about what's going to work for those schools as well as what works for the inspectorate.
Thank you. Lucy, anything you wanted to ask?
No, it's just, again, just sort of listening in and thinking about the idea, well, do you then break it down into small parts? But then we've got a situation at the moment where in 2 days, you're trying to assess an entire school's working day, or what that looks like. And there are so many moving parts to that. How can you possibly give a decent assessment of that in such a short period of time? I don't think you can. So I don't know what the answer is in terms of that, but it is some food for thought in terms of what an inspection looks like going forward.
Fantastic, thank you. And Tracy, could I just ask you, as a school leader, when you heard that Flora Cooper was going to try to close her gates to Ofsted on Monday, what your initial reaction was?
Well, I think she was making a really good point and a really good stand, and it's interesting that she just wasn't allowed to do that. I think the problem I have with a lot of this is that Ofsted, the visit is so finite. It's such a finite thing, and actually school improvement isn't finite. And so, yeah, I welcome her and I support her doing that. And as a holistic picture, it's because why should it be such a marker in the sand kind of thing? School improvement is ongoing. It evolves. It's informed by a whole bunch of factors. Context change, staff change, policies change, GCSE things, everything changes all the time. And so for actually that finite summative thing, I just am fundamentally against, which is why I think Ofsted in terms of holding us to account, absolutely, we should be accountable. I have no issue with that. But actually my thoughts around this kind of yearly peer review where your geography specialist from another team comes in because you have identified that as a school priority. I think that's that's really about school improvement. I often say they're improving lives, but that can't be such a finite event. Like, yes, you've improved them. I'll come back in 4 years, so you're still doing the same job. So I support anybody who says enough is enough to the current system.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Callum, any thoughts that you had?
Yeah, I think that might be the one place that we potentially differ, Tracy. It is, I think as educationalists, we're not politicians, and we shouldn't be trying to be politicians. I know there's a certain irony on here representing the Lib Dems there, but it's not our place. Like, we're bound by the Education Act 2005. You can't refuse lawful access under that piece of legislation. I don't think it's any school leader's place to refuse access. You can make a point, you can make a protest, but actually, I think the statement of saying we're not going to allow access, the unions then all piling on and going, we totally support you. And then obviously having to climb down because there's a £2.5 grand fine attached to it. And the head teacher in question wasn't allowed to do it. I think it's potentially a little bit, it's acting in a political way that head teachers are not, the role isn't designed to be like that. We can have discussions about Ofsted. We can try and reform Ofsted. We can make policy suggestions, etc. We have our forums, we have unions, we have professional bodies to do that. However, direct action, direct stands, it's not the role of the teaching profession to do that. And I was, I must say, quite uncomfortable when I saw the idea of the protests, and more importantly, the encouraging of people to sort of come to the school, which again was then overturned at the last minute. The entire process of those particular couple of days did make me quite uncomfortable.
Now, Callum, can I just ask them, because interestingly there, you've positioned that action against Ofsted as a political statement. So do you see Ofsted as a political body then? They are a political body. If we are acting against Ofsted, we're not acting against the DFE in that sense, although they are in some ways directed by them. Ofsted should be, improving lives for children and for the profession and independent of political interference, for want of a better word. I know they are directed, and the DFE obviously directs a lot we do. But if we are taking action against Ofsted, are we saying that's political action then, or is it professional action against our regulator?
Okay, so I think in order to answer that, we have to look at the process for appointment of the chief inspector. So the chief inspector is recommended by the Secretary of State and then appointed subject to approval by the Education Select Committee, which can just be ignored. In this particular case with Amanda Spielman, they did recommend actually that she wasn't appropriate for the role. But the Secretary of State obviously overruled at the time. Amanda Spielman was appointed. I think that appointment in of itself was inherently political. So as a regulator, it was given almost political head. So when we come to looking at whether schools should respond in kind, I think sadly, our hands are a lot more tied. And the teacher standards tell us that our hands are a lot more tied in terms of political statements in the classroom or within the school environment. Now, I have my own political views. My sixth formers know my political views because it's relevant to think. They're not influenced by my political views, though. I make sure to draw in a very clear line between that. And I wouldn't want to make a statement publicly or otherwise that would jeopardize my sort of integrity as a teacher. And I think that's what Flora Cooper potentially, in my opinion, did when she decided to launch that protest.
My sixth form my A-level politics class tried for 2 hours to try and find my political views. And what one of them said after 2 hours was, well, all we know is he's not a racist. And that's all they could get out of me. Anything else we want to ask Callum or Tracy?
I'm just seeing a couple of comments coming in, Tom. I'm not sure if you can see them in the comment section from some of the listeners there. There's one about parental feedback there from Jimmy Owen, just asking, what can we do if parental feedback indicates that they want to keep the current grading system? So, I guess that's a question around if there's a disconnect between the profession, the politicians we've talked about, but what about what the parents want? Tracy, first, I guess, what are your thoughts on what parents want from Ofsted?
In the research I've carried out so far, I can't see any compelling evidence that parents are absolutely fixed to the grade. However, I think like any change to the system, you would have to do some sort of re-education around what the point of the report is. So if the report is to inform you about the school, what it's doing well and what it's working on, its current priorities, then the parents are going to get exactly the same thing back. If they want to look at some other quantitative data, they can look at the Progress 8 schools. There's stuff out there for them to look at if that's what they're interested in. But I haven't found significant evidence to say that they are wedded to the grades.
Thank you.
Just quickly, I just wanted to kind of come in a little bit in defense of Flora here. The point was, and I think in Callum, you saying that you're uncomfortable, yeah, because it took Flora doing what she did to kind of, make that point and bring it to the forefront and say, hey, she would not have had to go there had the situation not come to what it's come to. So I think did it get out of hand? Maybe a little bit, but it's starting to get things noticed, and it's starting to get the ball rolling. So rightly or wrongly, she did what she did because she felt there was a need. And I don't think it was unprofessional. I think it was someone saying, I love what I do. I love professionals. So, I'm going to protect it with every fiber of my being, and I'm going to speak out. And she did.
I think that's a fair interpretation of it as well. I think it comes down to your own opinion of the matter, and I think you can definitely make the argument that it started off as a professional protest, blah blah blah, and that's a perfectly fair argument to make. I think where it very clearly crosses the line is making a public announcement calling for people to be outside the gates protesting. I think that actually potentially puts children's safeguarding in danger, because you'll have a bunch of strangers turning up and almost hijacking the protest, because we know that happens with education protests. It happened on the march in London when I was on there. There were loads of people from the Socialist Workers' Party or Free Palestine campaigns who just decided to try and co-opt the campaign. It's like, actually, this isn't relevant to the current discussion. And I think that's a really, really important thing to notice. Is there was, I think, to my mind, a turning point there from protest over OFSTED to wider anti-government protest, which almost accidentally got inflamed as a result of sort of the public call for protesters.
We got one more comment from Leanne Hamley, who says, unfortunately, some schools didn't take career learning and the Baker Clause seriously until it came under the inspection of Ofsted. But the inspectors usually had no or little expertise in that area. The idea of using external experts who inspect but also coach for improvement appears a better way forward. Is it the case, that if you have Ofsted trying to evaluate a school but also coach for improvement, that they're spreading themselves too thinly, especially in 2 days? Or do we think that this is a better way forward? Tracy, I'll come to you on that one.
I can't see how that. I can't see how they happen at the same time. So, Lucy, you're absolutely right. How can you make this finite judgment in 2 days as is when you're evaluating a whole bunch of activity that a school is involved in? And also, it's so subjective. The team that come in are so different from another team that come in, and the team could come into the same place a week later and have different thoughts about it, depending on what they've heard or read or reflected on. And so I can't see that. I think the much better idea is your annual peer review activity, which is brokered sort of locally, thinking about context, and then Ofsted stay away from the coaching, and they come in and just do the quality assurance and hold schools to account, which is what I think that they should be doing.
I think that's a really interesting point. I think when it comes to careers in particular, if we sort of went around the room, we've not got time, but asked how we all ended up in teaching, I think we'd probably have 5 slightly different answers. What is good careers advice varies very, very differently child to child, and taking one sort of central approach it just won't work for careers education. Now, we know what provision is generally good. The research shows that, but actually what we don't know is actually how children, well, we know how children obviously develop at different ages, etc. People understand and know what they want to do at different ages. I mean, look at the number of career changes coming into teaching as sort of testament to that. People discover a new job later on in life that they might love. And I don't think careers education as a whole is equipped for that, let alone inspection of careers education. I think that's one of the areas where I'd say it's definitely not fit for purpose at the moment.
Callum, Tracy, thank you very much for your time this morning. It's been great to have you on for half an hour of your Sunday morning. Enjoy the rest of your weekend and take care. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
Lucy, Nathan, any final thoughts about Ofsted then? Oh, we're on this weird. There we go. Better. There we go. Any final thoughts about the last week?
I think we've reached the point where a conversation needs to happen, and however that conversation happens. And I agree, really with Lucy here when it comes down to talking about what happened with Flora, and I disagree with Callum. This is a new place for us, and you can see the unions struggling with this new place for us. That we are at a point where we are not willing to have what's happened for Ofsted happen again and continue to happen without question. Now, there might be missteps, as Callum thinks it is, but actually, we have never been here before. In my time in education, we've been against secretaries of state for education. We've been against the DfE. We've never been at the point where a large part of the profession, and there is public support for abolishing Ofsted. That is new, and how we go about this now is very interesting to me.
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, the question is, I've only ever experienced one Ofsted framework as a teacher, really. Is this better than the old framework? Where basically you could get your year 11s to go and sit the European driving license qualification, get a GCSE, and bump up your progress aid, and Ofsted look at you more favourably. I'd have thought that the current framework, yes, it's very punitive towards primary schools and early years in particular, and we need a separate framework for primary schools and for EYFS. But for secondary schools, the current framework is more holistic, it's less data-driven, and actually it tries to get the whole idea of a school and not just a very narrow sort of outcomes-driven approach.
The bit that struck me this morning is hearing people say inspectorate and inspections, and I've stopped saying that. I say Ofsted, and then hearing the tagline underneath, and I remember seeing it now, and it hasn't jumped out to me before, of improving lives. They are not the same thing. You cannot be coach and inspector. And that's the bit for me where think we need to sit down and have a frank, conversation. And that's what feeds the people, the advisors, and I'm not getting against anyone who, advises people on how to do better in their schools. But if you are selling products to help people do better at inspections, that's not coaching. That's not supportive of the school. That's part of the problem. And Ofsted cannot claim to be improving lives and putting out reports on how to do geography better. It's great to hear from them about what their thoughts of how we can better game the system that they've created. But you can't be both. I think from this, I'd far rather they part it right down and actually, inspect, but just inspect and cut all the other stuff out. Don't pretend you're there to advise me, or don't pretend you're there to improve the children in my school's lives. You're there to judge us.
You've then got a big problem there, haven't you? If you've got somebody coming in to inspect you and evaluate you and come up with a judgment of your school, whether or not that's a one-word judgment or a report, you've then got somebody coming in who's a school improvement partner whose job is to coach you through improvement. You then have a separate body coming in to do an annual safeguarding audit. It's just...
We have that anyway, Tom. We have that anyway. I've been in local authority schools where we're having mock steads, and then we've paid a consultant to come in, and then we've got the local authority advisors coming in, and they're doing an inspection and a walk around. We're doing all of this stuff anyway. The point is, at the moment, it's a Ofsted inspection that's your final judgment. And that worries me about it because, what if these inspections are a shock? And who has been in before that to make it a shock? Because when I had my last Ofsted inspection, and we're talking pre-pandemic now, but when I had my last inspection, we had a good idea of what that result was going to be because we'd had practice inspections, mock inspections. We'd worked with the local authority. We'd worked with our challenge advisor. We'd been through the process. We knew it was coming. So we had a good idea. The bit that worries me now is when those results are a surprise, it just shows the fallibility of the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My view, and I've said this to Tom Rogers, I've said this to you, and I've said it to a lot of people, is I think that there's too much unreliability in who turns up to the school on the day or in the week. And the fact that 2 inspectors could come up with a wildly different interpretation of a school and its strengths and its areas of improvement, I think shows, something quite, it's unreliable. And I've heard, and we've all heard, some real horror stories about inspectors in schools, some of which have been proven to be true, some of which we're not quite sure entirely how truthful, but embedded in at least some form of truth, of inspectors who are quite nasty and hostile to leadership teams. Whereas we had Ofsted this week, and what I can say is, regardless of the outcome, we know that we were treated fairly, we were treated with respect, we were allowed to put our case forward, our students were treated very well. Where our students were a bit nervous or reluctant to talk, the inspectors didn't take that of, they don't know what their curriculum sequencing is, but these are kids. So I think it's very much who actually turns up on the day that has a big impact, not necessarily on the outcome, but on your experience of Ofsted and how you feel about it.
My question for you on that, though, Tom, is what were you doing at 7, 8 o'clock the night before Ofsted? And
I was taking a photo of the Domino's pizza boxes in our staff room, which has had about 180,000 views on Twitter.
Right. And that is such a normal picture, right, that we don't even think about whether that is healthy for us mentally, professionally, as an organization, that it is entirely normal for us the day before an inspection to be in school, maybe 3-4 hours after we'd normally leave, having to buy in food because we're not going to eat with our families or go home to rest. And that just without blinking as a profession, we go, yeah, of course, they've got Ofsted tomorrow. Of course, they're not eating with putting their kids to bed. Of course, they're not eating with their partners. Of course, they're not getting, that is so toxic that is normal to us. That I think we as a profession need that time, a pause in Ofsted and take a step back and go, hang on, this isn't okay. This isn't normal behavior. This isn't right. And I think that part of us as a profession, we need to come together and take that on board and learning and go, hang on, actually, we are part of the problem in a sense, because we have normalized this high level of accountability and stress to survive it. And I'm not saying that's bad for teachers or that you're wrong to have done that, but it worries me how normal it is.
Mm-hmm. Lucy, do you think it's wrong to normalise the pressures and the expectation of these sort of informal expectations on teachers regarding Ofsted, the night before or whatever?
Yes, I mean it's the fact that we're sitting here and we can kind of joke about it, and your photo being a point of that, but it's also, I mean, yes, you're kind of making light of, you're trying to kind of find a sort of a moment in the darkness or whatever you want to call it. But in the same vein, it also makes the point of, well, yes, I'm making a bit of a joke here, but also this is a thing. And of those 180,000 views or whatever it is, there are people that are going to be like, oh, that's quite funny. But there are also going to be people that go, well, yeah, that's, people will have gone away and thought, that is a thing. And that is quite normal. So I hope that it has almost kind of that twofold. I mean, maybe I'm overthinking it, and maybe I'm kind of, sort of unpicking it now later on. But when I initially saw it, I was like, oh yeah, Tom's at school at 8 o'clock. I've been there, done that. But also, reflecting on it now, it's like, oh yeah, well, funny in the moment, but also kind of, that's also saying, this has become normal, and that's not okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Nathan. It's been a real bumper extended special. Thank you very much to Paul Gosling, Neve Sweeney, Tracy O'Brien, and Callum Robertson for joining us as guests on this week's weekly review. Next week, I'll have broken up for Easter. Anybody else?
Yes.
Fantastic. So we'll be looking forward to a nice, relaxed weekly review where hopefully nothing too big has been in the news. Possibly maybe the latest on the pay dispute. We're expecting something on that. We were expecting it yesterday, actually, but it may take a bit longer. Neve did tell us that the NEU executive met yesterday, so we'll see what happens based on that. But yeah, it's never quiet in education. And so we will see you next week for next week's weekly review. Take care.